Thank you, Dennis, for engineering this. And when Dennis asked if I would do it, I sort of said yes without much hesitation, because at that point I was really very, not depressed, but very concerned about what I thought was the state of the nation and its divisiveness, and spent a lot of time reflecting about Dartmouth on that. And so I said, yes, I really would like to. As we got closer to this date, I began to get cold feet. Maybe that was too political and wouldn't be interesting. But interestingly enough, yesterday in the mail, without solicitation, I still don't know who sent them, 2 books arrived with nothing, no indication where they came from. And the first was entitled "It Could Happen Here" by Jonathan Greenblatt, who's head of the American Anti-Defamation League, ADL. And the other is a book, "Dignity in a Digital Age," both of which were themes that I want to talk about. So I figured if they thought they were important enough to write about, and they were published the books and somebody nicely sent them to me, it may have been the Southern Poverty Law Center. They send out books periodically. I decided I would go ahead and sort of follow through on what I'd planned to talk about. And yeah, I'd like to emphasize these are reflections, but as I look at the world, I feel like in many ways that I'm in a Groundhog Day movie. If you look at the agenda for the Supreme Court over the next 6 months, there are all the issues that we were dealing with at Dartmouth in the 70s and 80s and the 60s. They've just recycled and have come back again. So it's it's worth reflecting on what Dartmouth was like in that period. And I think it may have something to say about the current period. When I think about Dartmouth and the time I spent there, the 20 years, 19 years I was there are 2 things that stand out. Obviously, a lot of the people, the leaders who were there, people like Kemeny and Reeser, Lou Martin, who I worked with a lot and very closely, people like Jim Hornig, Bill Davis, Marissa Navarro, and I could go on listing. Jim Wright was an associate dean at that time. But what I learned at Dartmouth, one of the most important things I learned, I think probably mainly from Kemeny, but also Reeser, was that institutions should be judged, particularly educational institutions, should be judged not by just what their graduates do, but what the institution, independent of what the graduates do. And that's a really tough hurdle to get over. I'm a Yale graduate. I can think of lots of things Yale graduates have done, but when I stop and think of how Yale has changed America, I'm hard pressed to come up with anything. And I used to talk about this when I was at Dartmouth. Dartmouth, as a small institution, gave us, Kemeny was the leader in this, but people like Hargraves and others, gave us time sharing, and it's not just computing, but he gave us a vision of computing as a resource for everyone and not as a limited resource for a few. And that was the great blessing of BASIC and time sharing. And I argue when people were honoring Steve Jobs and talking about Apple, I felt they underplayed the setting that Kemeny and Dartmouth created with time sharing and making computing a resource that individuals expected to have access to. Another area that I think Dartmouth has changed the country was with helping the founding of A Better Chance. And I was involved somewhat in the 50th anniversary, but in some ways I lamented that Dartmouth didn't celebrate that as much as I think they should have. A Better Chance, in response to the Peace Corps, the need for more diversity in the Peace Corps, it was created to try to basically fill the pipeline with diversity in a very fast way. And what A Better Chance has done over 50 years, and it did it very quickly, it eliminated the conversation in this country about, are those people qualified? The country developed other conversations to try to limit, but it simply ended the question, could they do it? I don't know if how many of you are familiar with what the Better Chance has done, but over 50 years, over 84, I think it was last figure I looked at, 84% of all A Better Chance graduates have earned a BA degree or higher. That puts that group in a higher class than any other demographic group in America. And I think it's an extraordinary accomplishment for an institution to have helped create something like that. So Dartmouth as an institution has made a huge difference. That's a very tough standard. I took it with me to Hampshire. I'm not sure Hampshire can claim to have succeeded, but it was certainly the barrier that the bar that I felt I had to get over. The other thing I reflect on Dartmouth in those periods is that it was at the center of all of the major controversies that we live with today. It didn't generate them, but it was very much at the center. You had it created, out of Dartmouth came the Dartmouth Review, and out of the Dartmouth Review came some of the leading intellectual voices on the right in this country. Some of the Dartmouth group were the ones who thought up back in at the end of the 80s, the brilliant idea of suing colleges for consulting about financial aid. Colleges had what they called the overlap group, and they were trying to spread the money as far as they could. And they came up with the conservative side that had opposed affirmative action, had opposed, they're trying to diversify the student body. They wanted it to be strictly on merit. Came up with a way that basically forced those colleges to back off the practices they had followed. I remember when I went to Hampshire, I asked the board, in all seriousness, I said, do we want to be sued by the federal government? Because all of that group are always described as the elite colleges of America. So shouldn't we try to get ourselves in that list, in that group? They didn't think it was a wise idea. So we didn't. But Dartmouth, during that period, was very, very much at the middle of most of the conflicts. And you could see it, and it was seen on campus. The review was basically the beginning of, I wouldn't say the beginning, but picked up on sort of the Newt Gingrich view of politics, that we will have an uncivil civil society, and uncivility is a really great tactic politically, and they used it to great effect. And it was part of the beginning of the kind of wedge issues in our society. And as I said, Dartmouth didn't originate this. They were simply a focal point where a lot of it came together and could be seen. The fact that Kemeny created Native American studies created a whole nother set of issues that highlighted those tensions between groups, the issues over the symbol. Women coeducation created a whole set of other issues around women's rights. Dartmouth hosted the Hastings-on-Hudson Medical Ethics Institute, out of which grew the Dartmouth Institute and medical ethics. But in 1971, 72, we were teaching courses on abortion, death, and dying, topics that most curriculums did not include. So Dartmouth created and was at the forefront of a lot of these fights. And yet Dartmouth was not torn apart by them. And I wondered at the time, and I've wondered since, how did Dartmouth hold itself together? And the one question that I'd like to come, tonight to people to leave with is, what was it at Dartmouth that held it together? And what is it going to be that holds this country together if we do hold it together in the present? And the answer I gave then, and I still think it is very true, is that the one thing that I think made a huge difference for Dartmouth was overseas study. Dartmouth had a mechanism because of overseas study where when I was there, roughly 60-some% were doing their basic language abroad. Others were doing majors abroad. But the effect of the overseas study program for Dartmouth was that you mixed the student body. People ended up in groups randomly. They didn't go as cliques. They didn't go as people they picked. They ended up in the language groups signed by, not randomly, but they were mixed. And so you had a system at Dartmouth that every institution has its cliques, every institution has its divisions. But Dartmouth had a mechanism by which the student body was being constantly churned, and year-round operation added to that. And I think that one of the things that made Dartmouth strong during that period and helped it weather the kind of divisions that existed then that are all now apparent today was the fact that it had that kind of mixing. And so the question I come up with when I think about the present as I bring that experience forward is, what is it in our society today that is going to create that kind of mixing? And I think the system is very broken. And I think that as a society, we're in extreme duress. I think that, and I don't want to get political, this isn't a matter of whether you voted for Trump or didn't vote for Trump. It's that we are a very divided society. A lot of what took place in Washington, a lot of what took place was taking place in the country, is this whole sense that there are basically two Americas. There's a working class America, there's the elite educated America. Colleges are very much responsible, not necessarily by intent, but we've created a system. The whole purpose of high school is getting into college. Since I retired from Hampshire, almost now 17 years since leaving Hampshire, I spent working with underserved high schools in cities like Gary and Detroit and Newark, Washington, places where the whole education system, I think, is collapsed into we simply have to get them into college or get them into a career, and the purpose of education has been lost, and it's not succeeding. And the impact of this is not just on the underserved communities. We see in higher education a much higher level of anxiety and depression among college students. They're arriving in college having succeeded, having gotten their high board scores, their high grade point averages, they're in college, and when they get there, they don't know why they're there. And one psychologist in Hanover made a very interesting comment to me, psychiatrist, not a psychologist, psychiatrist, said during the time I was at Dartmouth, he said, most of my clients were faculty and adults and other people in the community. And he said, today, 100% of my clients are students. And the indices of anxiety and depression have tripled over the last 7-8 years in America, because we're sending students to college. They don't know why they're there, what they're there for. So that the system is not just for the underprivileged or underserved. It's not working at the top either. The other things, other areas are clear. If I go back to my comment, if you look at the Supreme Court agenda, race is clearly a center and still is. I work with education in an education system that now is almost 99% unintegrated. The schools that I work in are 95 to 100% students of color. The communities I work with look at the world around them, and they can say, yes, there's been progress in civil rights. Yes, there's been progress in education. 8% of students of color or African-American students were going to college 50 years ago. Over 20% are going to college now. But they also know that more Caucasians are going to college now than ever, and that the gap between African Americans and Caucasians is greater today than it was 50 years ago. They look at wealth, and yes, there's been progress in middle class wealth, net wealth for African Americans. It's grown from 7,000+ to 14,000, 100% increase. But wealth for Caucasians has grown 100% also, from 70,000 to 140,000. If you're a Black, the gap looks a lot greater than it used to be. Justice, We don't have the lynchings. We don't have postcards celebrating lynchings. But for a student of color or African American, they still fear the law. They still fear judicial killings. It is not a safe society. So from the Black community, we have a lot of progress and no fundamental change. So that, and if you look at other indices, besides the justice system or the education system, the wealth system, the one area where there has been probably some closing of the gap is in health, life expectancies. But so you have a underserved community that sees the gap widening. You have a privileged community that is split and fears the future. So I think that when somebody like Jonathan Greenblatt talks about, it could happen here, he's tapping into a very significant fear. And so the question that I was hoping we could open up into discussion is, what, if I'm right that the kind of mixing that took place at Dartmouth in the 70s, 80s helped it survive being a centerpiece for all of those conflicts. And I know Lou Martin remembers, but firing line used to be the sort of the equivalent of Fox News in terms of looking at the really tough issues. Braden and names slipping my mind, but Buchanan were the two moderators, liberal and conservative. And one time they had an all Dartmouth cast, myself, the editor of the Dartmouth Review, Buchanan and Braden. So talking about race, affirmative action, and all the divisions in society. So Dartmouth was a symbol, and it was a recognizable centerpiece for that kind of conflict, and we survived it. So the question is, does Dartmouth have something to tell us today? I know that I skimmed Greenblatt's book, and he talks about national service as one way of mixing a population. The GI Bill did it for this country earlier. People have talked about national service. Clinton talked about it. That may be one answer, but I'm not sure we'll ever get there. And to me, one of the answers that is it has to come through education, and education has to do a better job of being a voice for how to break down those barriers, how to create less of a gap between, quote, the working class America and the educated America, how to break down the gap between urban and rural, how to break down the gap in terms of wealth. There's a group of colleges now, a group of people trying to transform, their theme is to transform the college from an enclave into the commons, the community commons. And the question that Dartmouth is going to face, I didn't pick this day, but Hanlon picked it. Dartmouth is going to be talking now for the next year as to what kind of president does Dartmouth need next. And that's also a question of what kind of presidents do higher education institutions need, not just Dartmouth. And my argument would be that higher education institutions need presidents who will focus on breaking down barriers in different parts of the community, will focus on how to create a stronger town gown, if you wish, relationship, but also a stronger relationship between the higher educated elite in the country and those who are not in college. How to break down the barriers that now exist that have created the kind of tension in our society that leads to the kind of divisions in our society. That's not an easy task for a president, not an easy task for an institution. But I think it's one that needs to be more in the forefront. I don't know the Dartmouth connections very well, but I was dismayed when I heard Dartmouth was paying students to live off campus, because I can't think of a more deadly act for a housing crisis in a community than to do that. Because students 5 students can live in an apartment that a married family cannot, because 5 students can afford the rent when 2 people can't. And so there are a whole range of issues that universities could take on and could play a role in if they felt that finding a way to unite us as opposed to divide us was their highest priority. Now that's a very maybe simplistic, I said these are reflections, but at the age of 82, I think about what my children and grandchildren were going to live through. I'm not very excited for them. I have a real fear that they're going to be in a situation that inertia will not solve. And in our country, I think inertia, a lot of people assume that inertia, we've been a democracy for all these years, so we'll continue to be one. But what has been is not necessarily what's going to be in the future. And it could happen here I think is a great title. I haven't read the book, so I don't know how much I'll like it, but it certainly speaks to what I think is critical. And I'd be very interested in terms of this group feeling, is this a role for the university? Is it a crisis? And is the question, how did Dartmouth hold itself together in the 70s and 80s, relevant for how we're going to hold ourselves together in this century? So Dennis said I could talk for 30 minutes, but my wife keeps telling me to talk less. So I'm talking less and throwing it back to the group to, I hope will answer, or at least respond to the questions. Greg, Dennis, take it over.
So everyone, you're muted, but John Engelman, you have your hand up. So why don't you go ahead, and anyone before you want to speak, you're going to have to unmute your microphone.
Greg Prince, when Hampshire College was was created, as I recall, it was a new model for higher education. They were going to redefine the paradigm of higher education. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the question I have is, can you take a few minutes to describe what Hampshire College was designed to do, and does that have any message for the issues that higher education is facing today?
I mean, John, thank you. I mean, I tried to avoid doing, please, selling jobs for Hampshire, but I'll take the chance anytime anybody gives me. But Hampshire was created in 70, I think, and it was created basically to change the intergenerational conversation. And part of his argument was that a lot of the resistance to change in any culture, in any society the greatest resistance is between generations. And I can go through a whole litany of issues. No think tank in America predicted what was going to happen to the Berlin Wall, or the Arab Spring, or the Iranian Revolution, because think tanks are generally led by the older generation that earned their stripes. They become the senior professors, and they're running those institutions, and they miss what the next generation is going to do. But Hampshire was created with, and this came out of the 60s, where the younger generation was screaming at the older generation about the war. And the answer, the response was very simple. The student will design the education, but they will have to negotiate a contract with the faculty to complete the degree. The faculty had to sign the contract. There were no grades, the contracts traveled. So the faculty knew that if they signed that contract, their colleagues in other universities would see those contracts, and they would be judged as much as the student. It was a brilliantly simple accountability system. And students were told, you can do anything you want if you come to Hampshire, as long as you can persuade 3 faculty that it's worth doing and persuade them to put their name on it. And believe me, that was not a simple task. And I had lots of students in my office crying, screaming, or angry that they had been told they could do anything they wanted and were having trouble getting faculty to sign it. So that that I think that has a lot to do with what's happening here. It could be very helpful. I mean, I think I found the most important thing at Hampshire was the absence of grades. The fact that you were accountable for what you did. I knew that when I taught courses, I knew that what I wrote on papers might end up passing through people at Hanover, and they would look at it and know me. And in the first couple of years after I left Dartmouth, I would get comments from people on the street in Hanover. I saw you haven't changed at all. You're saying the same old things and things like that. So, I mean, I knew I would be accountable, and I knew at Hampshire. I mean, every faculty's one of their major goals in life is to catch the president doing something dumb, and that was certainly true at Hampshire. And I knew that anytime I put comments on a paper, I knew it'd be seen by other faculty because they just traveled in the portfolio. I knew that I would be judged, and I'd get a lot of flack if they didn't think I was doing what I should be doing. I got a lot of flack because I didn't like what I was doing, but it would generate lots of conversation. So yes, I think it has a lot to do here, but I think that Hampshire, we were very well thought of in the community, but I don't think we did enough. And I think probably the biggest gap that I failed at, and if I hadn't failed at it, I don't think Hampshire would have run into trouble as it did a couple of years ago, is that I was not able to break down the barrier between secondary education and college education. My rap at Hampshire was there was never a high school program that Greg didn't love. I tried to build any and every possible way I could build ties between the Hampshire faculty and college and high schools. And I was not successful, at least the extent that I think I needed to be. And that's actually what I'm still doing now, is trying to develop. And actually, interestingly enough, some of you know the former president of Smith, and is now president of Prairie View A&M. And I'm trying to work with Texas, with Prairie View, University of Texas A&M, Prairie View campus, to create a program that reaches out and involves high school students more and earlier in colleges, and basically creates independent projects in which the student is guided by, and this is the requirement, a team of one faculty member from a college and one high school teacher. And the purpose is not just to give the student experience in doing independent work before they get to college, but is to create a mechanism where high school teachers and college faculty have to work together. And I think that would help, but it still doesn't get at some of the other class issues, rural versus urban, educated versus manual labor, divisions that exist that have just grown up. It's hard to point the finger at anybody, and all of the focus on getting people into college is appropriate, is important. I certainly believe that getting a college education is important. But one of the unintended consequences is if you don't have a college education, you must be uneducated. And that creates a division in the society we also don't need. So that's part of my answer about where sort of Hampshire fits in all of this.
Thank you.
Dennis, you had your hand up.
I thought I might wait until the end.
Okay. I'm a little curious about you were talking about students going to college and they're not sure why they're there, and a large amount of depression and mental health issues, even pre-pandemic. We just hear about it even more now. What's changed in the last decade to trigger that?
I'm not sure who I'm speaking to, but
Oh, it's Greg Ames, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see who was speaking. I'm talking about. I mean, I think a lot of it ties back into the whole College Board testing issues, the testing society that we've created. The College Board was created, and SATs were created as a way of trying to open up colleges to a wider audience. The unintended consequences, I think, have been fairly drastic. That the college board system made respectable kind of the standardized test. And then when we had no child left behind, American education was transformed into a very test-oriented thing. And I'm vice chair of the board of a big charter school in Washington, D.C., 5,000 students, 5% of all the students in the District of Columbia. And I see it in everything we do. And as much as I resist it, I can't stop the juggernaut. The whole accrediting accountability system for charter schools is based on tests, so that everything is designed to build up your test scores. All of the ratings of the charter board of the schools is based on test scores. The high schools compete. They have their accountability tests. The teachers are then driven in to teach for the tests. I'm involved with as an advisory employed by a group in Arkansas. I managed these are anecdotes. This is why this is reflections. This is not a sociological study. But I managed during the beginning of COVID. They had to stop all the music, all the singing, the chorus work, because singing is a good way to spread. So I managed to find that there actually are singers' masks. A student I worked with here in Hanover, who was in Hanover High School, ended up in a school in Texas. She sent me a video of a concert she was doing. And all these kids were in a big church singing with singer masks. Sounded absolutely gorgeous. And I called her and she said, yeah, they're singer masks. You can buy, and I went online and found them. So I bought 150 singer masks for the group in Arkansas. And I called and asked, what happened to the concert? And this is a group I work with. And I said, well, we finally had to give it up because we had to prepare for the tests. Now, I happen to believe that those kids singing for 6 weeks to prepare for a concert would have done them more good preparing for the tests than whatever they were done, but I think I was in a minority there. So, Greg, the answer to me is that we've created a system where quality is judged by performance on tests. And Dartmouth does it, Yale does it. And so a kid gets, instead of only gets 700 on a board score instead of 780, and they're not good enough. Don't look at that institution. So it's a bias I have, but it's a feeling and so when you have students who are working, their measurement is getting into college, everything they've done in high school, whether it be, at Andover and Exeter or, Barringer High School in Newark. They're measured on that scale. And when they get to college, the question is, why are they there? And that is a huge issue. And certainly, it's much easier for students coming out of private schools. But the group I work with in places like Newark, these kids are getting to college and they have never written a 10-page paper. They've never done an independent project. I had a student who I got into Hampshire from Hill House High School in New Haven. And he said Hampshire was the first place he ever read an entire book. So and that comes back to the world. One of the divisions in our society is that the underserved communities, Black and brown students, the gaps are not being closed; they're widening. But the education system is doing that to them. I don't think is doing any favors for the privileged side either.
Yeah. So then I would take it that you are in support of eliminating SAT requirements in college entrance.
Yes, I arrived at Hampshire and they never required them. I wasn't smart enough. After I left, it never occurred to me, but now you may not send them to Hampshire.
Really? Wow.
They're redacted before the file is ever seen.
Now, how I would also imagine that that standardized test scores are somewhat of a crutch for the admissions department. Did they find that their job was significantly more difficult not having those as a means to weed out and cut off
No.
categories? Interesting.
I mean, we had a one-liner that I've done a lot of recruiting, and when I was working in, I think Newark, I would go to all the college fairs and sell Hampshire College. And the sign we put up is, ask us why we won't allow you to send us your SAT scores. and our answer, and they would always ask, they would always come up and ask. And I said, because, we're interested in your story, not your score.
Yeah.
And the kids got it right away. It was one of the best one-liners we had for recruiting, because the students understood exactly what you were saying in that one sentence.
Yeah. No, totally.
Greg, let me,
I'll stop monopolizing.
okay. Can I ask a question or make a statement?
Yeah, and why don't let
I believe Alan has a hand raised.
I don't
I'm
think-
sorry.
It's Gregory, Alan Rozicki here.
Hi, Alan. How are you?
Good. I hope the family is well.
Thank you.
Good. I'd be interested, try and put on your hat a long time ago of an 18-year-old coming to college, Dartmouth College. How would you answer your question that you posed? Why are you here? What do you expect? And I think back when I was 17 and a half and arrived at college, I was awe-stricken. I couldn't answer that question very well. I'd be interested in how you'd answer it now reflecting back.
Well, I mean, I'm dealing with 17, 18-year-olds all the time, not since COVID, but before that. And it is really hard to answer that. And what I would do with them is that I say, I said, my role is to really give you permission to dream. And college should be a place for you to dream, a place for you to try, to experiment, to look, to answer questions, to explore. And it's interesting, when I'm talking about kids about college, one of the questions I will get them to, what are they doing in the summer? And I will ask them, I'll have 25 students in front of me. And I will ask them the question, if you didn't have to worry about money and you didn't have to worry about all the pressures you're under, taking care of siblings, doing everything, if you could do anything you wanted, anywhere you wanted in the summer and earn all the money you needed, what would you do? And 99% cannot even imagine the question. It takes an hour and then a week and then a month to get them to a position where they can begin to imagine a different story for themselves. So what I tell students when they're looking at college is find a place where you think you can write lots of different stories for yourself. And that you don't have to complete a story, you have to be able to write it. So it's a place for exploration. You have to prepare students. To get anything out of it, you have to be prepared to do that. You can't just walk in and start on day one with a new mindset. I've been programmed for the last 4 years to show up in these courses, to get these grades, to do the following things. And I'm coming to a college that expects me to get the same grades and do the same things, but but will and has the capacity to offer a lot more. And the question I asked at Dartmouth, and I ask of every student I've ever asked, every student I worked with at Dartmouth, did Dartmouth demand of you all you expected it to demand of you when you first entered? Now, this was, 40 years ago. This is not scientific, but very consistently, 8 or 9 out of 10 said no. Now, Hampshire, when I got to Hampshire, I asked the same question there, and I got all the way up to 4 or 5 out of 10 said yes. But, you know, we don't demand of our students all that they're capable of. We don't, you know, the phrase we try to use at Hampshire is our goal is to make them partners, not objects. They should be partners in the process, not objects of the process. And certain places at Dartmouth had incredible record of making them partners. Tended to be more in the sciences and in the arts to some extent. But and that again, I argue is a problem in high school education. The students are simply perceived as objects, not as partners. And they have very little, students have, certainly in the wealthier schools they do. The schools I'm in, students have almost never done an independent project. Wouldn't even know where to start. I don't know if that answers the question, Alan, but you know, in many respects, our role should be dream coaches. But that's not our role is often very different than that. One of the things I thought that one of the great advantages I thought for year-round operation at Dartmouth was that it forced you to ask it forced students to ask why they were there. You couldn't just, you weren't on autopilot. You didn't arrive in September and leave. You had to make decisions. You had to decide, am I going to be here this semester? Am I going to be here this quarter and the next quarter? Which program am I going to take? How am I going to organize it? There was at least an automatic process that forced students to ask questions. And that was one of the reasons I, supported it and really pushed when I came there, was, walked into a wonderful opportunity. And I would argue that Dartmouth never fully took advantage of year-round operation. It took 10 years after Kemeny left. McLaughlin had a vote as to whether they wanted to even keep it, and I think McLaughlin was very surprised when the faculty and students voted to keep it. But it was a slow uptake, and I can't judge it now because I don't know how it works. I don't have enough input from students. But I still think one of its advantages is it forces students to reflect on why they're there, what they're going to do next. So it's hard to be on autopilot. Maybe that'll be a blessing about COVID because it's forced everybody to rethink what they're doing, but I don't know that.
Virginia has a question.
I saw, yeah.
Unmute.
A tiny bit of background. I raised my family in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, where I was a public school English teacher. And one of the great experiences was when the ABC program came to Longmeadow.
Yeah.
And we were so close. And I can remember standing up at the town meeting talking about why we should do it. Oh, anyway.
Thank you.
It was terrific. I also, by the way, I went to Vassar, and my roommate's husband became the chairman of the board of Hampshire College at one point, Colby Hewitt.
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you.
Anyway, so that's a little background. My question, and having had a son at Dartmouth and a granddaughter at Dartmouth, if I were asked what I would do now, I loved Vassar. And I think all that I could possibly had dragged out of me I really worked really hard, but I think I'd go to Dartmouth now if I were going to do it again. And I think the foreign studies program, I agree, was absolutely fabulous. And I was curious to know what you thought about the freshman trip program as having that same kind of mixing people up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Um,
Dartmouth really did it long before anybody else.
Dartmouth was the first. I mean, you're right.
Yeah, yeah.
I can remember getting on the top of Lafayette one year. I think, I don't know, I can't remember, if somebody in computer science was with me, one of the faculty, but we're on top of Lafayette at noon, having lunch. And there were, I think, 6 or 7 groups from different colleges and schools, prep schools as well as colleges, all doing freshman trips.
Yep.
And they all had their packs, and all of their packs had exactly the same kind of label on them, which was reflected the degree of difficulty, and some each had the same letter that we had because we were on Lafayette, so that meant that was that class thing. Not only did Dartmouth do the freshman trip, but it disseminated the freshman trip all over certainly New England. I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I know that my only sense was it might have been too good a thing because it was certainly not the most bucolic moment with something like 50 people on top of Lafayette, but it was still fun. You're right.
Well, I remember vividly being at Hopkins Center when we were doing a program, the Friends of the Hop were putting on and we needed to move chairs. And there were no people to move chairs, facilities wise. And I said, okay, wait a second. I will go down and I will get some Dartmouth kids. I went to the mailbox and there were a bunch of Dartmouth kids who just come back from their freshman trip. And I said, hey guys, I need help. Would you come up and help me? And that group, there were a couple of lovely blonde, long-haired Southern girls, a couple of Black boys, and they were so close because they had all had
All been on that trip. Exactly.
Yeah, it was fabulous. I've never forgotten it. So,
And that's, I mean, so the question is, is national service another way of accomplishing that? It may be, but I think a lot can be done by colleges and doing that and finding ways to reach into the community where you're not saving the community, but rather, I mean, the phrase, it may have come from me, but you're making it the village commons, not the enclave. Not easy to do. We did a lot of it in Holyoke and Springfield, Hampshire did, and we had a very good reputation for that. And we worked at it, but it was hard. Even I had board members who wondered what we were doing sometimes, and I just think as a country we are very divided, and there, my argument is a liberal education. You can get a liberal education in anything you're doing, anywhere you're doing it. And conversely, you cannot get a liberal education anywhere that you're supposedly doing it.
Yeah.
And we have to find a way of creating a greater sense of what that education is broader than simply what you know. I mean, I loved, since I was given permission to talk about Hampshire by Greg, I think Hampshire had the best college motto in the country, non satis sciri, to know is not enough. It's a phrase that as a president, I could talk on for I could make 25 speeches and never repeat myself using that opening. So, but there has to be, otherwise, one answer is I'm not sure what will bring us together. But the one thing I know won't bring us together is inertia. If something doesn't change, I think the society, we're at a point where, leaving aside political positions, we've accepted that truth is simply a device, that winning, where a culture, a book came out written by a Hampshire alum back in the 70s, The Cheating Culture, in which he lamented the slow win at any cost culture that was evolving in corporations and athletic programs, and the sort of erosion of a sense of principle. And if you read that book today, you look at today and you say, this is exactly what it had foretold. that the corporate culture of profit above sort of the community has its cost, and there is a slow erosion of what binds the community together. And I think that, if I were, I remember going to China and seeing the huge Maytag factory. But if I were sitting in Indiana and I worked 30 years building up the Maytag Corporation, and I received notice that I was losing my job and that was it, I would be a very unhappy camper and feel I had not been treated justly.
Greg, let me, if I could, I try to meet with undergraduates at the college from time to time, just to get their perspective on their Dartmouth experience. And I happened to have lunch today with 3 members of the class of 23, all women. And one of the questions I asked them was, you have friends at colleges, other colleges and universities all over the country. How do you think your Dartmouth experience has been different than theirs? I mean, obviously a lot has been similar to their experience.
Right.
And the answer that struck me strongest that I heard was, at Dartmouth, you learn to work with other people. You build teams. You want to succeed, but you don't want to succeed at the expense of your fellow students. And they said, the friends they have at other colleges, that's a quality that the students at other colleges don't experience. The collaborative effort that takes place. And I said, why is that? Why is it different at Dartmouth? And they said, well, one is perhaps the small scale of the college, where not everybody gets to know everybody else, but you get to know a wide range of people at the college. And you don't want to succeed at the expense of other people. So you build teams and you work with each other. And I think that's one of the principles, one of the factors that has existed at Dartmouth for a long time, and why Dartmouth has been able to get through a lot of the issues that other colleges have not been able to get through.
That's the essence of what the overseas study did.
Yep.
Because what I saw time and time again is you end up in Blois, or you end up in someplace, and you're living with a family, and you barely speak the language, and you come together as Dartmouth students for class. That coming together was like this adrenaline. I've been saved. I can manage this group because I can talk to this group, I can communicate. Then for 12, 15 hours, I might be back out learning the language. But people bonded together in those circles. They collaborated with each other to survive the emotion of suddenly being the odd person out with a whole new language. And that was a form of collaboration.
Absolutely. The other thing that these women mentioned is, you get to know each other so very well at Dartmouth because everything takes place on campus. You primarily live on campus, you dine on campus, you take classes on campus, you socialize on campus, you recreate, if that's a word, on campus. You go to a school like, I had a nephew who went to Columbia. He got a wonderful education there. But he spent more time in Greenwich Village and Soho and other areas of New York City than he did on campus when he had the free time to do so. And you don't get to know each other very well in those situations. So
I think another support of what you're saying which nobody anticipated when we created year-round operation, was the creation of sophomore summer.
Yep.
I mean, that wasn't required, that just evolved. But that's part of that. The students decided that that was really a good thing and certainly distinctive. There's no other college in the country, no other sophomore class in the country has that experience.
Right. And it's a bonding experience for them.
Absolutely. I mean,
There are only 1,000 students on campus that summer.
small number of students and all in the same class.
Yep.
I'm guessing that we are getting close to the end, and I want to thank Greg for accepting my invitation. I wasn't sure what I was going to hear, but let me tell you a little story about 1976. It was our 10th reunion, and we were celebrating at the Hanover Inn. The whole class was there for dinner, and we had invited a famous Dartmouth speaker to entertain us, and that was Al Foley. And you laugh, and yet his speech was so much like what we just heard from you, Greg. The times were tough. We were in the middle of a war that we shouldn't have been in. And he was letting us know how privileged we were and how we could go out and actually make a difference. It's nice to hear it all again. And the times we're in are just about as trying. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yes, thank you, Greg.
I thank all of you for taking the time. I really love my 19 years at Dartmouth, and I was given an incredible experience and opportunity. I hope the conversation I hope the charge to the next president is to do something like this, because Dartmouth is one of the places that could do something about it.
Greg, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Greatly appreciate your insights and wisdom and sharing them with us. So,
Yeah. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
I'll wave to my dad now.
My daughters, I had to be careful what I said. Dartmouth alum.
Hi.
I sent the link out to somebody that I wasn't supposed to, but anyway, so.
I have to ask a favor. Could somebody please send him that picture of my dad at Moose Lock Ravine Lodge? That's fabulous.
Tara,
It's
send me
in
your
the
email.
archives. It's in the archives. Dennis, thank you for making it happen. Greg, thank you for doing it. All of you for being there. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll put the link in the chat, actually.
Bye,
I'm just
Tara.
recording now, but-